Hello and welcome to the introduction for the book club series, particularly series 1 and 2 on prose. My name is Rose and I am so excited and so honored to go ahead and introduce this series to you and give you guys a bit of an introduction to this particular series and take our time looking over what exactly the series is going to be about and also the books that we will be covering. And to start off, again, I would like to just reiterate that this is the book club series divided into parts 1 and 2, series 1 and series 2 here, and I would also like to note the following. There will be 10 books per series, totaling up to 20 books, and then 10 authors per series as well, with 19 total. The one overlap there will be William Shakespeare. Of course, he is going to be absolutely necessary for this book club series, and we can divide it into two generally different camps. One camp being Series 1, which is going to be talking about literary works that are almost always required reading. Additionally, I would also like to note that these books in particular can be seen between, I would say, middle school and early high school. This is probably the time period in which you will be expected to either read these books or have some knowledge or would be recommended to read these books because they are very, very fruitful literary pieces that I think that every single student, especially during those grade ages, would be able and should be able to read. Additionally, with Series 2, we go a little bit more advanced with this one, so it's a bit more advanced literature that is often taught in courses as well. This would be anywhere between end of middle school, early high school, and probably the middle of high school as well, depending on the classes and depending on the kinds of studies that you are participating in. And so with that being said, we have Series 1, again, literary works that are probably going to be more directed towards middle schoolers and early high school students, alongside the Series 2, which is going to be talking about more advanced literary works. And so when we're talking about these series, they all generally take the same exact format. And so for each single book, we're going to be having 4 different lectures on the book, and they will be broken down as follows. Talking about who the author is, giving us a little bit of context in terms of that. Then an entire lecture dedicated to the plot summary of the literary work. Then moving on to themes and symbols, oftentimes 3 of the most famous ones alongside 3 of the most famous symbols. Again, these are going to be the generally most talked about ones and also the ones that tend to be referenced the most often, especially in classes. And lastly, we're going to end with a vocabulary review with vocabulary that would have been mentioned during the plot summary, specifically going over 10 of them, talking about the way that we can use these words and also looking at their synonyms as well. And so when we come to the end of it, we will be looking at 40 lectures per series. And so for each series, again, 40, adding another one, we have 80 videos total for us to peruse and also base our opinions and our education on. And so for that first series, we'll be talking about these following 10 books, starting with Keyes's Flowers for Algernon, then Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, moving then quickly onwards with House on Mango Street, Of Mice and Men, Lord of the Flies, The Outsiders, Animal Farm, To Kill a Mockingbird, The Hobbit, and of course Edith Hamilton's Mythology, which of course is going to round us out and be a really good segue into our secondary series, which goes as follows. These are going to be, again, the books that are a bit more advanced. We have Fahrenheit 451, The Great Gatsby, Pride and Prejudice, The Old Man and the Sea, Hamlet, The Alchemist, Frankenstein, The Kite Runner, Things Fall Apart, and Great Expectations. Additionally, we have put a little bit of thought into the order of these books as well, and so they should be going from more simple, much more easy to understand, manage, and probably going to be more of a foundational literary work, and then moving on to the more difficult ones as well with harsher themes, and also the books that will be most likely read, particularly when we get a little bit older, either into early high school or middle of high school. And so again, those are the books that we will be looking at specifically in this book club series. And so the question then is, why do we need a book club series? What's the importance of this all? Why do we need to be thinking about this as we're moving forward? Well, the answer to that is that every essential book you will need for school will all be here, all in one place. Oftentimes, a lot of parents will ask me, so what is the reading list that I need to get to you? What is the reading list that my students should be reading and, paying attention to? Are there any books that they need to be looking at? And so when I hear these questions, I always think to myself, the same 20 or so books, oftentimes with different kinds of themes, and sometimes I'll mix it around. But the reason why we do that is because we want to talk about different kinds of themes, different kinds of symbols, how to read a book critically as well. And so when we're doing all this, when we're also talking about the way that current academia is structured, we have all these books that no matter where you go, you will be expected to read at least a handful, if not all, of these books that you are going to be seeing specifically in this series. Most of the time, people tell me that these books are the ones that they are expected to know. These are the books that they are expected to write about and also be able to summarize in class. And so why do students need this in particular? We want to be talking about heightening the understanding of English literature. Additionally, symbol themes and summaries of classic literary works, and of course, raise English comprehension and analytical capabilities. And so just to break this down a little bit, let's start with that first one there. Heighten understanding of English literature. Oftentimes, we think of English literature as something that's hard to accomplish, something that's hard to attract to us, and also maybe even consider sometimes. It's very difficult. And completely understandably, it's not our first language, and so I completely get that too. However, when we're looking at English literature, we're talking about really good synonyms. We're talking about really good writing structures. We're talking about really good vocabulary as well. And so that is generally how we tend to look at English literature, especially for us as second language learners. But also, we want to be able to think about this critically. Oftentimes, books like these are going to be coming up, especially on our exams, during essay portions, and also, of course, by the time you get into high school and hit that final year, you are going to be interested in taking that AP English literature course because that is the one thing that will help you get into university. Additionally, talking about symbols, themes, and summaries of classic literary works, next time when you go into an English class and they are saying, oh no, we're going to be talking about this specific book, you are no longer left in the dark. You have an understanding, you have an idea about what this book is going to be about, and you're able to participate in conversation, add to the discussion, and impress your teachers with the knowledge that you already have about the book, about the themes, about the symbols, and even some fun facts about the authors. And so, combining these two, you will be able to not only increase your English comprehension, but also your analytical capabilities. Not simply just reading a book and closing it and never thinking about it again, but thinking about it a bit more in depth. Thinking about maybe if that was the case, then maybe this is a reflection of the society when this was written, or perhaps the author's own main intentions. And so also keeping those contexts in mind, we get a much more fulfilling experience reading English literature. And so there are three key questions asked by teachers oftentimes, and this series will also be addressing these three particular questions. Again, every single teacher asks these three questions. This series addresses all three. First one, who is the author? This series will be talking about the author for its entirety, for one whole lecture each time. So when we're talking about the background information, we're going to be talking about the author, where they were born, their other experiences that they've had, and what actually led them to writing this. On top of that too, the kind of critical reception that they have also received in terms of this literary work. Then we ask, why is this book important? If it's important, we're reading it, but then what makes it so important? Well, this is where the context comes in. Not only do we have that plot summary, but we're also talking about the symbols, the themes, and the way, again, the book is written, especially in a particular time period. Also showing why it's something that we need to be reading in the first place. And lastly, of course, what are the main themes and symbols? 3 of each for us to peruse. And again, this is going to be where we have a lot of those essays, analysis, critical thinking coming in, particularly for English classes, because that's where it shows that we've actually read the book and we actually understand exactly what it is that they're talking about. And some additional perks of this series too will be discussing idioms and vocabulary that are useful that academies do not teach. Now, oftentimes when we have some kind of book club series, we're talking about the book, we're talking about the author, and the symbols and themes. This part is not something that is brand new. However, this series is also going to be including an entirely new section specifically dedicated to vocabulary words that come up during the discussion of the works themselves. Additionally, cultural and historical context that schools and academies forget to mention in class. Again, we have the idea of who the author is and what the book is about, but what about the era in which the book was written? What about the era in which the author was born? All of this is going to influence the literary work in some kind of way, and so with that in mind, we want to be able to draw on these bits of information and really grow our understanding of the literary work itself. And once more, books can also be used all the way up until AP English Literature. I cannot stress this point enough. Parents will ask me, so what's the class that my student needs to take in order to get into a really good university? Oftentimes that answer will be AP English Literature because it shows analysis, critical thinking, it shows that you know how to write, how to read, be very comprehensive in your work, and again also shows that you have a lot of good, well-balanced learning going on inside that noggin. And so, for that reason, when we're looking at these books can also be used on the AP English Literature exam, specifically that writing section. And so, keeping that in mind, if that is a goal for your student, that is one thing you want to be considering when looking at this series. And so when we're looking at who is this lecture for, we have 1,000 plus vocabulary words included with definitions, synonyms, and antonyms, and sample sentences too, with a wide variety of books, themes, symbols, and vocabulary review at the end of every literary work. And so not only, again, do we have the book itself, but we also have words related to the book, words that are very difficult, words that would also come up on SSAT, SAT, and TOEFL exams. And so a good example of this would be the word hubris. This is taken from Mythology by Edith Hamilton, and this is a word that we would be talking about in the same manner. So talking about the dictionary definition, then going on to talk about some synonyms, some antonyms. Sometimes there will be a lot, sometimes there won't be that much. But the point here being is that we have a reference as to what this word means when we run into it, when we actually end up reading this book. And then we will see how this word is particularly used in an example sentence and see the ways that we can probably change that around with even a different synonym if that's necessary. And so when we talk again about who is this lecture for, we're talking about opening it to middle school students and early high school students, specifically who need quick and easy book summaries. And so if there are books here that you have never heard about or are on that reading list specifically that every student will end up getting every single year, if that is the case, this series is going to provide that foundation. So when the time comes and that book is the next one on the list that you have to read, there will be enough information there for the student to be able to read it quickly, understand exactly what it's talking about, and be able to reflect on this series in particular and draw on the facts here to be able to participate in discussion and also have a more fruitful understanding of English literature. And again, all books are just required for upper level courses such as honors, AP, and IB. We've talked about AP, IB is very similar, and of course honors classes will also talk about these advanced literary works and expect us to write a lot of different essays. And so again, having that knowledge of literary works is going to help us a lot in terms of expanding our own English ability, but also doing well in these classes. And so when we're talking about it, the necessity, again, not just the book summary, but covers the author, vocabulary, culture, and history. All necessary context to understand the literary work completely. If anything, this is the key point that I would like all of us to take away from this intro, which is that we're going to be talking about this book in many different ways. And so keeping that in mind, again, adding that context that's absolutely necessary for us when we're going to be reading these books. And again, once more, designed to satisfy the course requirements for high school English classes. These books are directly taken from English syllabi, so classes that are specifically for honors, AP courses, also for freshman and sophomore level courses as well. Even some early, I would say, here high school and middle school level courses too. Kind of cross-referencing all of them, we took the 10 of the most popular there, as well as the top most included literary works that I would say schools here oftentimes teach. And so a little bit about myself and the work that I tend to do. I am currently an international and overseas educator, specifically working on exams that deal with English, and so TOEFL, SAT. I also work on essay writing and university entrance exams, and I also work as a consultant and do work with other students for their university applications. Here, that would be the statement of purposes. Furthermore, I am a native English speaker from the United States. I was born and raised in California until I got my high school degree, and then I swiftly moved to Korea to receive my degree in English language and literature from Korea University. I was able to graduate with great honors with a 4.32 GPA, and very recently as well, I was able to graduate from Carnegie Mellon University with a master's in literary and cultural studies. Furthermore, Currently, I am working on my Doctor of Philosophy or my PhD at the same school, at the same program, specifically working on decoloniality, post-colonialism, diaspora, as well as contemporary American studies. And so this is all to say that I personally have gone through this system before. I have read all these books as well. I've experienced exactly what these books are going to be entailing. And so keeping that in mind, learning them also in American context, taking that AP English exam, I can say right here, right now, that it's going to be very necessary, specifically for any student who wants to really succeed in American universities and American schools. And so at the end of the day, when we're summing this all up, we have this idea that this series is going to be talking about books, literary works, explained in an easy, clear, and entertaining way that you won't be able to find anywhere else. Again, not just the book, not just the author, but context, history, making it fun, making it entertaining, but also adding that extra dictionary definition of these words that we're going to be looking at when we're going through them. Again, having all these different aspects are going to add for a much more fuller experience when it comes to English literature. And with that being said, thank you so much for listening, and I hope to see you in class soon. Here we are with a completely different book. Of course, like always, I want to create a variety for you guys because that's what's important when we're talking about literary works, and especially in our book club series. And so for today, we're going to be talking about Of Mice and Men by John Steinbeck, and this is probably one of those books you have absolutely heard of before, very much in the same vein as Romeo and Juliet. Definitely one of those books you're going to hear about and absolutely going to read. And so very important that we talk about this, know who exactly the author is, John Steinbeck, as well as the storyline of Mice and Men, before we go into the themes and symbols like we always do. Again, this is one of those books you will almost always have to read. In fact, this is probably going to be on any of your reading lists coming in the next few years. And so please make sure you guys are paying close attention to this one in particular. And if you have any questions, make sure you go ahead and just keep your eyes open because maybe I'll answer them for you guys on the way to the very end. And so for today, we're going to be talking about the author, who John Steinbeck is, what his history is, who he is, and what kind of context this book was written in. That way we have a better understanding of what is going on in the actual story of Mice and Men. So this is John Steinbeck, and of course on the right we have Of Mice and Men, one of the many book covers for it. He was born February 27th, 1902 in Salinas, California, and he is very prominent in this area specifically because a lot of his works tend to take place in these kinds of spaces, as well as his understanding of migrant workers. That's something that I'm going to be discussing in more detail, but for now, all we really need to know about John Steinbeck is that he is considered one of the prominent, if not one of the most quintessential American writers that we know today. Same kind of author might be somebody like F. Scott Fitzgerald or perhaps Mark Twain. These are the authors that we think about when we think of American literature, and specifically 1900s American literature, 20th century American literature. And so knowing that's something that we just want to keep in mind, that he is probably one of the forerunners of this genre. He's one of the best at it. He has many accolades under his name, which we will be discussing. And so he knows exactly what he's talking about when you read any of his books. Another author I would also mention is probably Ernest Hemingway as well. These authors, when you read their books, are very much America-centric, talk about the American dream as a theme, as well as the values of what makes America, America. And so if you guys are unfamiliar with American history, or perhaps the way America functioned anywhere between the mid-1800s to, let's say, the mid-1900s, so about a century there, if you are unfamiliar with that, I would definitely say that it's important to you guys to brush up on your history a little bit so you understand what happened in America that led to this point, that led to a work like Of Mice and Men or Grapes of Wrath being written and making a lot of sense for the American reader. Because again, this is something that is very particular to America because of the situations that were happening, as well as the Great Depression. It's all something we need to keep in mind because it really shows how much value we put into certain topics in these novels. So, John Steinbeck, for instance, today we're going to be talking about him. He attended Stanford University, big name, big whoops, but he did not graduate. Instead, he started writing his career in 1929 and had very little success until he published Tortilla Flat in 1935. You'll notice, though, if you end up reading a lot about more contemporary authors or perhaps even just authors in the past as well, this is a phenomenon. A lot of writers do not finish university or get their bachelor's degree. In fact, they go to a good university, but they tend to drop out, go back in after a certain amount of time. Sometimes they'll get a master's or a doctorate, but oftentimes it's not necessarily the case because they tend to just change their perspective or change their course of life by writing instead. And of course, if you have a good story, then it's important that you write it. John Steinbeck here, he started writing, didn't really get that accolade or get any of that applause that he expected. However, after he published a story called Tortilla Flat in 1935, he started to gain some recognition and he was getting very famous for his work after the fact. And so it did take him a while to get on with the writing that we now know today as quintessential John Steinbeck, but afterwards, after he really got it rolling, he definitely got it rolling and he got a hang of it. And so that is how we come to Of Mice and Men. A recurrent theme in all of his literary works is the emphasis on the ravaged and disparaging lives of people, with a specific emphasis on migrant workers in his narratives, some including in The Dubious Battle and Of Mice and Men. Of course, this is the book that we're going to be discussing today, but this is a very common theme in a lot of his literary works. He tends to discuss a lot about the sadness and also the disparaging. So, for instance, it would be maybe something that is not as successful as you might think it is. Very challenging, fraught with conflict, and a struggle to continue to do. And so it's about people who constantly struggle to make a living, constantly struggle to make something good happen in their lives, and how them, as perhaps specifically migrant workers, are looking for a way to start anew, to start fresh, to have a better life. And this ties into, of course, if you guys are familiar with it, the American dream. If you're not familiar with the American dream, don't worry, I will be discussing it later on in our plot summary and our theme and symbolism sections, so don't worry about that there. But for now, that's just something we want to keep in mind, that this is something to do with the American dream. And also, he has a very big relationship with this migrant worker narrative because he saw it so often while he lived in California, which was where every migrant worker was coming to. Remember, if you guys are familiar with American history, the Great Depression occurred, and also everybody was moving from the middle or the Midwest to California because they believed that's where the gold was, that's where new life was, that's where life would be better. And so he saw this coming into his state firsthand. He saw this relationship, he saw this life firsthand, and that's why he tends to write a lot about it. His most famous work, however, was not Of Mice and Men, but rather Grapes of Wrath, originally published in 1939, which was awarded a Pulitzer and later helped garner Steinbeck a Nobel Prize for Literature in 1962. So, as it says, Of Mice and Men is probably the one that we will be reading because it is short. It is a very short story. It's a novella, even shorter than A House on Mango Street. And it's easy for students to read because this concept is quite simple, even though the story might be quite advanced for some people, but the actual reading section is not that difficult. However, Grapes of Wrath is much thicker, it's a much more challenging novel, and it has much more complex themes and ideas, and so that's probably one of the stories that we might not touch upon, especially if we're in high school in a country that is not America or Canada. It was originally published in 1939, of course, and that one was awarded a Pulitzer, and later on helped garner Steinbeck a Nobel Prize for Literature, which is probably every writer's dream to have a Nobel Prize in literature. And this is just a movie poster of the Grapes of Wrath film by John Ford with Henry Fonda, and this is one of those old-timey movies that really just stand out as just a testament to time, that even now, even if you watch a black and white movie, it still makes sense and it's still considered a classic. He emphasizes the relationship between his male characters throughout all of his novels and was often criticized for being superficial or too focused on morality. Now, as somebody who's read Of Mice and Men, I completely understand where this statement is coming from because a lot of the stories, and especially for Of Mice and Men, is about the relationship between two men, George and Lenny, and how they are too focused on morality sometimes, especially with George, not really with Lenny, I'll say, but George for Lenny. And also it's about how they relate to one another, their superficial relationship at times because they want that farm, I would go so far as to say. And so a lot of times his relationships and the characters that he focuses on are predominantly two men. And it's about their friendship and how they tend to grow as people, and also perhaps how they don't grow, how they are lacking growth, and how they maybe stay stagnant instead. He wrote a few more works and became a filmmaker before passing away in December 1968, only about 6 years after he got that Nobel Prize in Literature, and he passed away in New York. And so that's pretty much what we want to know about John Steinbeck before we move forward in our context. And so the reason why it's important we talk about John Steinbeck's background, of course, is because his personal experiences directly tie into the story as well as his other literary works that really relied on that migrant worker narrative, that migrant worker American dream narrative that he kept seeing as people moved into California. So a little bit of context about the time period itself as well as just Of Mice and Men. World War I caused many people to migrate from the Great Plains states to the Great States. Now, with all that being said, let's go ahead and take a look on the plot summary for The Outsiders by S.E. Hinton. Now, I will warn you guys, there are a lot of characters that we have to go over, and I will try my best to make sure that it is clear and you guys can kind of follow along. Also, it doesn't really help that some of the characters' names are very similar to one another, so I'm going to be making it kind of clearer, hopefully, going through the story together. So, to begin, Ponyboy Curtis is a member of the Greasers, a gang of poor teenagers with long, oily hair. Now, this is just a common trait among Greasers at the time because it was the style of how they wore their hair. They were oftentimes growing their hair out a bit. It was kind of long, never really shortcut. And what they would do is they would be putting grease in their hair or oil, and they would get a comb and they would either push it back or comb it through. But what you would just kind of want to know is that their hair was a symbol of their status as a greaser. And so hair was very important at this time. How you styled it really made a difference as to who you were and how you identified yourself. And also, our protagonist, or our main character, is Ponyboy. While returning home from the movies one night, Ponyboy is attacked by the Socs, a gang of rich kids from the west side of town. When Ponyboy shouts for help, his brothers Derry and Soda Pop, along with other greasers, rush to his rescue. And so one night he's coming out of the movie theater, he's doing great, he's doing fine, and then suddenly some Socs come up to him, and then they get into a rumble, they get into a fight. And because Ponyboy at this point in time is not an older kid, he's quite young, I would say mid-teens, 14 to 15 years old, he's not necessarily the kind of kid that can kind of fend for himself at this point in time. And also, because of the tensions between the Socs and the greasers, when they see somebody by themselves like that, that is kind of what happens. They go into full-on physical assault mode. And so because this middle school kid, this barely high school kid, is being attacked by a group of rich kids from the west side of town, he shouts for help, and his two brothers, as well as other greasers, rush or, run to his rescue. And we have two different names here, Derry and Soda Pop. Soda Pop is his middle brother. So Ponyboy is the youngest. Then on top of that is Soda Pop. And then on top of him is Derry. And Derry can be referred to as Daryl Curtis. Derry is also the name that he goes by. But he's about 22 years old, and he's the oldest of the group currently for the three. After ascertaining that Ponyboy is relatively unharmed, Derry scolds him for walking alone and tells him that he should use a bit of common sense. Derry wants intelligent and talented Ponyboy to do well in life. As a result, he constantly nags Ponyboy to do better in school. In contrast to the resentment Ponyboy feels about Derry's intrusion, Ponyboy adores Soda Pop, his middle brother who is a high school dropout working at a gas station. And so we kind of learn a lot more about the characters and the character dynamics, especially with the three brothers. So Ponyboy, Derry, and Soda Pop, specifically for Ponyboy, he has a really good relationship with Soda Pop. He thinks he's really cool, he kind of wants to be like him, and also he thinks that Derry, on the other hand, while meaning well, is oftentimes kind of stepping on his cape, is kind of stepping on his toes a little bit, keeping him from doing what he wants to do. However, Derry, knowing that Ponyboy is smart, knowing that Ponyboy has a future ahead of him and that he's talented, wants him to really focus on his education instead, and also maybe avoid these altercations, no matter how easy it might be for him to get into them, because again, he as a greaser will always be the enemy of a soc. Ascertaining here meaning specifically that he learned that Ponyboy is okay, so relatively unharmed. He's still kind of harmed, but overall he's pretty okay, he's doing right. Derry scolding him meaning that he kind of critiques him, criticizes him, punishes him verbally, and constantly nagging him to do better in school. Derry specifically wants him to do really well, and so he goes ahead and kind of tells him like a mom would to a child, like, hey, you need to study. Come on, you need to go do your work, and Ponyboy doesn't really want to hear it. There's the resentment that Ponyboy feels because of this intrusion, so he doesn't like the fact that Derry went ahead and said this, or again, kind of stepped on his toes. And on the other hand, Ponyboy really does care for and adore or enjoys Soda Pop's presence as well as what he kind of stands for. The next night, Johnny and Ponyboy go to the drive-in with the fellow greaser Dally. Despite Dally's unpleasant behavior towards two Soc girls, Ponyboy strikes up a friendship with one of them whose name is Cherry Valance. As they walk together, Ponyboy and Cherry find that they have a lot in common. So here, the next day, they go ahead, Ponyboy and Johnny go to a drive-in theater. And a drive-in theater is pretty much a movie theater that isn't inside, but rather you go in your car. And so at this time period, a lot of things that people would do, especially these high school students, would be to get into these really nice cars. And instead of paying a fee for every single person, they would be two people in the front, and then a bunch of people would be hiding in the back or in the trunk so they don't have to pay admission. And then you would drive into a designated parking spot with a speaker, and you get to watch a movie on a really big screen. And because it's in an open atmosphere, really good place to hang out, and it's very easy to walk around and pick up food and whatnot, which is exactly what Ponyboy does. And during this time, him, Dally, and Johnny are there, and that is when he becomes friends with Cherry. And Cherry is, surprisingly, a Soc. She is on the other side of the fence. She is on the other side of the line, and surprisingly to the both of them, they are able to find that they have a really good connection. They're good friends now because it turns out as they were talking that they realized, oh, we have a lot in common. We're kind of the same age-ish, and we're also talking about the same topics. We have the same interests. And so they have a lot in common. They become friends, and in a very almost Romeo and Juliet way, I wouldn't call it romantic in a sense, but two different, let's say, communities are able to somewhat bridge the gap between their differences through this friendship. Additionally, we have another character here named Dally, and Dally is nickname for Dallas. And Dallas is probably the most violent of every single person in this story. He has the biggest history with gang violence, and so it makes a lot of sense as you read it that he would be the one that's a bit unpleasant towards these two Soc girls because that's just his history as this character. Suddenly, a blue Mustang pulls up near them, and two members of the Socialism emerge from the car to confront them. A fight almost takes place between the boys, but Cherry prevents it by getting into the Mustang. And so at this point, there is another idea that, oh, there's going to be another rumble. There's going to be another fight. Of course, Ponyboy has been told by his brother, don't get into any more fights. There's going to be one, but because the Socias are really just saying, you know, like, we need to keep our lines clear, Cherry says, you know what? I'll figure this out. I'll go ahead and de-escalate or make sure the fight doesn't happen, and gets into the Mustang instead. And I'm going to pause for a second and show you guys this photo right here of the cast of The Outsiders. And now you might think that these guys are people that are quite young, but this movie came out a very long time ago. And the reason why I can say that is because for you guys especially, the most famous person on this page here would be the person at the very far end on the right. And that, to you guys, would be Tom Cruise. And so at this time, this was a very famous movie. This was a very famous cast, and also stands today as one of Francis Ford Coppola's very good, very well thought out and standout works in terms of film. Ponyboy falls asleep in the park, then goes home only to be berated and slapped by Derry, who was frantic with worry. Berated here meaning that he is, again, punished. He is told off and slapped by Derry, his older brother, who was frantic or going crazy with worry. Then Ponyboy rushes out of the house and goes to the park with Johnny, where they encounter Bob and Randy and several other socials who attack them for being with their girls earlier. In the fight that ensues, Ponyboy blacks out and Johnny, in self-defense, kills Bob with his switchblade to save Ponyboy. So, to explain what happens here, Ponyboy falls asleep in the park after the entire thing happens at the movie theater or the movie drive-in. And so he goes back home, and when he gets back home, Derry is like, where have you been? What have you been doing? How is it that you've been out for so long? I can't believe you would do this to me after all that I've told you, kind of condemns him for what he's done. And then Ponyboy doesn't want to hear this, doesn't want to take it, doesn't want to listen. So he runs out of the house. He runs almost away. He runs away and goes back to this park with Johnny, where they encounter or they meet Bob and Randy, which were the boys inside the Mustang, as well as other socials. So it's not just them two, it's other people as well, and they start to attack them for being with their girls earlier, meaning that, okay, so you were hanging out with our girls, you were hanging out with Cherry. To cap it all off, to cap off this story that is To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee, we gotta talk about the themes and symbol like we always do. And the first theme that we're gonna be talking about today is the theme of courage. Now, before I go into this and explain to you guys what this courage theme is, let's look at this quotation here before we get started. I wanted you to see what real courage is, instead of getting the idea that courage is a man with a gun in his hand. It is when you know you're licked before you even begin, but you begin anyway, and you see it through no matter what. You rarely win, but sometimes you do. And this is by Atticus Finch. This is the father speaking to the kids. Courage in To Kill a Mockingbird is not about winning or losing. It's about thinking long and hard about what's right instead of relying on personal prejudice or gut reaction, and then doing what is right whether you win or lose. In the story, Jem and Scout equate courage with strength or willingness to take risks, so they do not associate their quiet father as someone who is courageous. So, just to explain the first part for us here. So it doesn't really matter if you win or lose, as long as you tried and you have the, let's say, the will to try, the will to move on, knowing that it doesn't matter if you win or lose, knowing that you could lose, knowing that you are facing failure, but you still try anyway, that is considered real courage. However, in the story, Jem and Scout don't really see their father as somebody who is courageous. Of course, we all probably want to think that our parents are courageous and they can face down failure and say, you know what, I'm still going to try anyway, and they still make it at the very end. However, for the time being, in the very beginning, when Jem and Scout are still quite young, because this story takes place over the course of 3 years, they don't think that their father is quite courageous. They think that he's very soft-spoken at times and is very stern, but not necessarily courageous. They think that it is more courageous to do it in action and to be very bold about it. And so, in a way, you could consider them courageous in their own minds when they are going upon the Radley property, trying to sneak around, see what Boo looks like. They might be considering themselves courageous in that kind of context. However, real courage is not that. Real courage is something that is quite different. Specifically, as the story unfolds, Atticus's determination to face down the racism of the town and defend Tom Robinson implants a lesson deep into the minds of the children, which is that is what is considered truly courageous. He knows, Atticus knows, that he does not have a good chance or pretty much any chance of making sure that Tom Robinson is found not guilty. He knows this because we've already had the lynch mob that stood outside. We already know that Mayella as well as Bob Ewell are just not good people. They do not like the idea that they will be perhaps shunned by the community if they are found to have fabricated these lies. He also knows that the jury is all white. He knows that the entire audience listening to this conversation is predominantly white. And also the people who are in the rafters, so the colored section, let's say, I put that in air quotes because that's the label they would put on that section. They're the only ones who are in favor of Robinson being found not guilty. Everybody else wants to find him guilty. Everybody who has a say in the building wants to find him guilty except for Atticus Finch, especially in the lower sections of the building, so the first floor. He knows that he's not going to win. He knows that this is a near impossible feat, but he still tries his best, and he still stands up for Tom Robinson from the very beginning. The moment he takes him on as a client, he doesn't have to stand in front of the jail and say to the mob, you know, you guys need to disperse, get out of here. And he doesn't have to go the extra length of telling them, you know, this is not right, you know, he deserves a fair trial. He doesn't have to say any of that, because he knows in the end he's going to lose, but he still does it anyway because that's the right thing to do. And that, knowing that you can fail, knowing that there is failure ahead of you, is what makes him courageous. And that is the lesson that Jem and Scout fully understand later on after they see it happen in front of them. They understand that no, my father, the Atticus, my lawyer father, is somebody who is incredibly courageous because he knew deep down that he wasn't going to win, but he still went through with it anyway because it was the right thing to do. Because it's the only thing that he should be doing. That is where the theme of courage really shines brightest for Atticus, and just overall, I would say, that is how you can see this theme specifically shine the brightest. Then we have the theme of prejudice, and I'm going to just point out to you guys one thing. In this film, very specifically, this was a choice made, and a very specific choice that was appropriate for the time period. Tom Robinson's here, Atticus Finch is over there, and then there's the rest of the Maycomb civilians who are just trying to hear about this trial. They want to see what happens. As you can note, every single person is white. The African American section would have been somewhere up here in the rafters, in the second floor, the nosebleeds where they can't really see what's going on. And so looking at this image, we already have an idea that it's one man or two men versus the rest. Nobody wants him to win. Everybody has prejudice against him already from the get-go because he's different. And that difference is stemming from prejudice. Excuse me. In To Kill a Mockingbird, there are many prejudices that people harbor. They are religious, racist, classist views, but they all share one thing in common. They treat people as groups, demand conformity, and give no respect or credit to individuals. The most obvious form of prejudice is the racism between the white and the black citizens in Alabama. And so, To Kill a Mockingbird is filled with prejudice. There's a lot of prejudice from every single character. The only character that I would say doesn't have any prejudice, I think there are two very specifically, would be Atticus as well as Boo Radley. They are the two that we can kind of understand as the ones that don't really have a clear prejudice against one or the other. They're kind of standing more in the middle, they're more neutral about it, or they don't say anything at all. However, everybody else does have prejudice, even the main characters, Jem and Scout, which is very important for the storyline when they meet who Boo Radley truly is at the very end. However, the main three that we see are racism, religion, and classist views. There's a lot of racism specifically in this novel, and it really just centers around the black and the white communities in Alabama. And this is very easily seen, especially during the court cases, especially during the conversations between Alexandria and Calpurnia. We have that very clearly at us, showing us how prejudice works in these kinds of scenarios. Yet, prejudice is also visible in the racially condescending Mrs. Grace Merriweather, in Aunt Alexandra's and many others' characters' belief in the importance of social class, in the gender stereotypes that people try to force on Scout, and even in the way the town views Boo Radley as a monster because he acts differently from everyone else. So it doesn't always have to be racism as well. We have the idea of racism showing up quite a bit at the very beginning. However, there's other aspects as well. So for instance, we have this idea that we have to have a social class distinction. So when Aunt Alexandra shows up, she thinks herself higher than everybody else. And we have that stratification again. Then we have the gender stereotypes that people try to force on Scout, who's just a young girl, but yes, she dresses a little bit more masculinely. But does that really matter? Not really. She's just a kid who just wants to play around. However, her aunt says to her, you need to act more like a lady. You need to act more like a girl. And so we have that prejudice there again, that all girls need to act the exact same way, which is just like Aunt Alexandra, which is very feminine and very poised and very kind, but that's just not the truth. Additionally, we even have the way that the town views Boo Radley. Boo Radley is also victim to a lot of prejudice, especially from the town. Everybody thinks that he's a dangerous recluse. Remember that. In the very beginning, when they're talking about him, it's because of the rumors around town that he's dangerous. He's a dangerous recluse. He's not a good person. He is very dangerous. It's constantly the fact that he's dangerous. But once we get to know him, once we get to meet him, it's very clear that that's not the case. And also, Scout and Jem also had the exact same ideas that he was dangerous. They had these imaginations and these fantasies when they were acting them out, that he was a very mean or bad person. But as we know now, he was the one who was putting the presents in the tree, mending his pants, Jem's pants, I should say, as well as making sure that Scout was warm and protected during the time when she was sitting outside at night. And so, just overall, we also have this giant theme of prejudice just overarching through the entire novel, talking about how it's not just race sometimes, it's also social class, gender, as well as just personal preconceived notions of somebody. So, for instance, if I saw somebody dressing a certain way, then I would assume that that person works in a certain job or has a certain occupation just by looking at them. That is also a form of prejudice. I personally do not know them, but I'm already judging them before I get to talk to them. I don't know who they are. I don't even know their name, but I'm already judging them. And that happens quite often for a lot of us. And so it's important that we are able to break that down, understand where that comes from, and analyze it here in a way that it is easy for us to understand as well. Then we have the theme of growing up. This is the final theme. So in the 3 years covered by To Kill a Mockingbird. And lastly, for this novella specifically, let's talk about the themes and symbols that are most prevalent, I would say, in this story. Now, we've already kind of talked about the idea of the American dream, and while we can say that Gatsby is a very good representation of this, I'm not going to be spending too much time dawdling and talking about the American dream because that's something we've already discussed in a prior novella. So instead, we're going to be talking about a few different themes instead, as well as some different symbols. One other thing that I do want to note is that a lot of teachers tend to teach this novella specifically for its length, because it's not that long, as well as the fact that there are very clear themes and symbols within the novella that are really good practice, especially for students who want to take more analytical courses, such as those AP or IB courses. If you guys are interested in those, you do tend to read this book more often than not, specifically because you are practicing for, how can you pick out some themes? How can you pick out symbols? It's really good practice specifically for that. So you might come into this very easily if you are, say a student who is interested in this kind of writing. So the first theme that we're going to be talking about is the theme of time, and this also constitutes past tense and future tense. So future time, past time, any time in between, we're talking about just temporally what is going on. So Gatsby and Nick are at the opposite ends of the time spectrum when it comes to time as an element of focus on their lives. So Gatsby is haunted by his past. The love and lost love of Daisy, his poverty-ridden upbringing, his entire fabricated identity are clear evidences of how his past controls Gatsby. Gatsby goes so far as to believe that he can repeat the past if he is wealthy. I'm going to be talking about that a little bit more in the quotation section, but for now what we want to focus in on here is that these two characters, Gatsby and Nick, both have a different perspective on life as well as time. So for Gatsby specifically, he is constantly consumed by this idea, this thought, this desire to repeat the past, to live in the past, because that is where all of his successes and his, let's say, most important parts of his life, specifically Daisy, really reside. Additionally, he's constantly haunted by his past, so his relationship with Dan Cody, the fact that he was born into a very poor family, the fact that he had a lot of experiences in the past that shaped him to the person he is today. He's haunted by his decisions in the past. He's haunted by the fact that he never was able to marry Daisy in the past. And that's why he has this obsession of recreating all of it, restarting the entire thing from the very beginning. That way he's able to fix his wrongs, turn the wrongs into rights as he moves along with time and try to repeat the past. And this is one of the most important lines of the story. Again, we'll be discussing that more in the quotation section. But this really does encapsulate what kind of person Gatsby is. Because we might assume because he's new money that he's looking towards the future, because he has a new house, because he works in, tries to create a life for himself through bootlegging, and that's a very common current experience. We might assume that, oh no, he's looking towards the future. In fact, he's constantly haunted by the ghosts of his past instead, and that's why he can't really see a future ahead of Daisy. He only sees up to Daisy, and anything after that he doesn't really have a plan for. However, on the other hand, Nick is a little bit different. Nick's relationship to time is focused on his future. So in the book, Nick is seen to be studying bond markets for his future. Also, he mentions on his 30th birthday that the next decade of his life is a portentous, menacing road where he senses troubles ahead. And this is another way we can see time as well, the idea of foreshadowing through Nick specifically. Remember, this book was written in 1925, published around that time, and this book takes place in 1922. And so at this point in time, the Roaring Twenties is at its peak, Jazz Age is at its peak, everybody's having a good time, everybody's drinking, everybody's having fun. However, what comes right after the 1920s is the Great Depression, and that is when everything collapses. All the fun and the frivolity is gone from the face of the United States pretty much, because that's when we have the droughts, we're not able to make enough money, people are going hungry, people are selling their children just to put food on their own table. And so we can see that there is something going on in the future that is definitely going to be negative. Nick constantly looks towards the future, whether it be for himself, such as studying bonds, or perhaps looking at the future and calling it a portentous, menacing road where he senses troubles ahead. It's not just for himself, but also for the entire country. There is a sense of foreboding that there's something wrong that's going to happen. And Fitzgerald was able to actually foreshadow this and also kind of guess that it was going to happen anyway. Because again, this book came out in 1925, Great Depression doesn't hit until late 1929 and early 1930s. And so we see that there is a very big relationship with the characters and time, whether they are looking all the time towards the past, or they're constantly just looking towards the future, what they can do next, how they're going to adapt towards the future and make it better for themselves. So we have that relationship here. Then the next theme is money, and money is definitely one of those themes that kind of tie into class structures as well. So broadly speaking, it's money and class structures. So The Great Gatsby portrays three different social classes. So first being old money of Tom and Daisy Buchanan. Then we have new money, which is specifically Gatsby. And if you really wanted to go farther and maybe extend that a little bit, you could even say Meyer Wolfsheim. And a class that might be called no money, which is George and Myrtle Wilson. Also, there is a new class that can be classified as a middle class, portrayed by Nick Carraway. This class represents those who have professional jobs that produce enough income toward leisure spending. And now that is where this idea of the middle class really does stem from. Surprisingly, for a lot of people, they didn't believe that middle class and the idea of a middle class, as famous as it is now, as common as it is now, didn't really start until, or maybe come into such commonality until maybe the early 1900s. That's when we start to really see it, and it really booms in the 1950s. And so we have these three, I'll say just generally, three types of social classes. So the old money, so people who kind of grew into it, people who got inheritances. And in a way, Gatsby could have been this kind of person as well by getting an inheritance from Dan Cody. However, he was unable to, so he became new money instead. He started making money at an exorbitant amount through bootlegging, and that was how he was able to match the wealth of Tom and Daisy. Again, West Egg and East Egg, they're both expensive neighborhoods. And of course, Gatsby is able to throw parties every Saturday. He doesn't care how many people show up. And constantly, it's this giant mansion. There's so much money going around that Gatsby clearly has enough money, or even more money than the Buchanans at this point in time. Then lastly, we have George and Myrtle Wilson, who have no money, or they might be considered the no money class, specifically because they live in the Valley of the Ashes. They work at a service repair shop. They do not really have a bright future ahead of them. That's also kind of influenced by the fact that they can't really escape the Valley of the Ashes. And so we see that there are clear divisions among all these different, let's say, social classes. Additionally, having this middle class as Nick Carraway, you can maybe even put Jordan Baker into this as well, because as a woman, she has a professional job as a golfer. So you might be able to put her into this category as well. Not necessarily new money, because she doesn't make as much as maybe Gatsby would, but definitely between middle class and new money is where I would put Jordan Baker. The Great Gatsby shows the newly developing class rivalry between old and new money in the struggle between Gatsby and Tom over Daisy. As usual, the no money class gets overlooked by the struggle at the top, leaving lower class people like George Wilson forgotten or ignored, while middle classes are there tottering on the social edge of the upper class. And so old money versus new money in relation to Daisy, we see, of course, the new money, Gatsby being here, look at all these nice things, look at this mansion, how I bought this just so I could be across the river from you, across the bay from you. So, this is our relationship. This is how much money I have, how much I can offer you, versus Tom, who has that notoriety, who has that title, who has that old money title, and he has that to offer to Daisy. However, the no money class aren't really looked at that much because they are without money. They don't have money. That's why at the very end, after Myrtle dies, Tom and Daisy and Gatsby, Jordan, also Nick, everybody's able to walk away from this experience pretty much, especially when Myrtle passes away, without really having a lot of impact in their own personal lives. They are above it because they have money to forget about it. And that's why George Wilson also has that experience of, perhaps not having another way out, that this is the only direction he can go. And he also has that old money to new money, or I should say, no money to new money relationship where he wants to get rid of that class. You can even read it that way if you want to go to an extreme. And lastly, we have, of course, the middle class here with Nick Carraway and Jordan Baker, who are included in the conversations in the new and old money. With Pride and Prejudice out of the way, of course, like always, we gotta go over that vocabulary in this vocabulary review, specifically going over our plot summary and our themes and symbols section. So, for today, these are the words that I definitely want us to take a good look at. These are the words that were mentioned on the PPTs in the lectures. So I think it's sensible for us to say, maybe these are the ones that we want to be looking into. So we have the words subtlety, condescension, unfold, indignity, hysteria, dawning, sensible, target, motives, and manipulate. And I think all these words, while, maybe making a little bit of sense now, maybe having a general idea of what they might mean, I think we can actually benefit more from actually going over these ones, because some of these other ones we've either already discussed, have an idea already of, mentioned in another synonym section, or perhaps it's not necessarily something we need to learn right now at this moment. And with that being said, let's start off with our first word today, which is subtlety. This is a noun, the quality or state of being elusive and difficult to perceive. If you are being subtle, and the word subtle can also be used, as a verb or perhaps an adjective. Adjective is most common, I would say. Subtlety is the act of being difficult to perceive, saying that, it's existing, but I can't really tell. Or maybe it's there, but I can't really, immediately latch onto it. For instance, if somebody's wearing perfume, but the perfume is very light, then there's a very subtle aroma. There's very subtle scent in the air. Artfulness, cunningness, guile, slickness, or sneakiness is another way to say it. If you're being subtle about, maybe, if you want to say that you are cheating on a test, I think this is the best example of this. If you're cheating on a test and you want to be careful, then you might say you are being sneaky, or you're being slick, or you're being cunning or artful, or having a little bit of guile when you do it. Same thing. If you're doing something to not get caught, then maybe you want to use the word subtle. I'm doing it subtly. Or if I'm trying to eat some chips inside my classroom, but I'm not allowed to make noise, then I will subtly open up the bag. Same thing applies there. Then for our antonyms, we have ostentatiousness as well as garishness. Okay? Take a look at that word. It's really long, I know. Ostentatiousness. We appreciated the subtlety with which our host indicated that it was time to leave for the beach trip. So subtlety here meaning that it wasn't straight up. They didn't just say, hey, you need to go to the beach trip or let's just go. They mentioned it in a very casual, unassuming way that was difficult to perceive. Like they didn't catch on to the fact that this person was saying, let's head to the beach. They simply realized after the fact that that's what they were doing when they said that one thing. And this is an art form, especially when you're speaking, that's very difficult to grasp, especially for anybody who really wants to be a really good talker. It's important to be a very subtle talker as well because you can really influence the way other people might think, just as, like a little fun fact for you guys. Then we have the word condescension, which is a noun to a patronizing attitude or behavior. Not really a good word, I will say, you guys. If you condescend somebody, that's on you. That's a bad thing to do. And if you are receiving that, somebody's being condescending to you, then I will have to say, just bear through it. It is difficult, I know, but definitely it is something that you do in order to make somebody feel bad about themselves or to criticize somebody. So synonyms would be haughtiness, superiority, scorn, disdain, airs, or snobbery. And antonyms would be respect, regard, esteem, admiration, and consideration. If somebody's condescending you, they're not just simply saying that you are worthy of being critiqued. They also don't think that you are on the same status as them or the same level, let's say. If I am condescending to somebody, then that usually means that I don't see them at the same level. Like we don't look eye to eye, they are below me. Same thing with the word condescension here. Normally it's to make them feel smaller and to make yourself feel a little bit bigger. Public health zealots among us sometimes alienate the holdouts through the smugness, condescension, or lack of sympathy. These public health people who are absolutely obsessed with this idea, they don't tend to just, tell us what to do. They will condescend us. They think that we're lower than them because we don't believe the same things. And that is how we can use the word condescension in regards to person-to-person conversations, that if you're being condescending, you're looking down on them, okay? Then that means that we're moving on to our next word, which is the word unfold. Now, this is probably one of those words that I will say that all of us already know. Unfold is quite a simple word, and it's not something that we tend to use only because there's not really a lot of opportunities for us to use this. Unfold doesn't necessarily mean to physically open a fold. Like you can say that I unfolded my, laptop, I unfolded the piece of paper. Yeah, you can do all that, but it also means to spread or straighten out. And this can also be about abstract ideas. So for instance, the mystery unfolded, meaning that the mystery was wide open now, or the plot unfolded. That meaning, whatever it is that you're reading or touching or looking at, it's starting to clear up. The complexities that are coming through, you're understanding it a little bit better. And so it straightens out not just the actual physical idea or the physical entity, but also the idea that's inside of it as well. So synonyms here would be expand, extend, outstretch, open, or outspread. And antonyms are close, contract, or fold. The news began to unfold quickly as soon as the breaking news anchor switched on to talk about the latest tragedy. So it started to quickly unfurl. Everybody started to understand a little bit clearer what was going on. The story was being straightened out because the new breaking news anchor came onto the screen to talk to the audience. I would say that a lot of these words we already know, but they all have pretty much the same kind of connotation as well, meaning the definitions are the same, and pretty much you can switch it out whenever you want. It all kind of means the same thing, so don't worry too much about, is this one better than that one? They're all okay. However, if you want to focus a lot on that familiarity or versus, formality kind of issue, then I would say expand, extend are the ones that you want to use in your academic essays. So anything that has to be a bit more formal, those are the words I would use. And if you're talking more about like person to person or maybe having a speech or a presentation, open, outspread, those are good too. If not, just go straight with unfold. Unfold is also quite a very, I would say, a sonorous way or a very pretty way of saying the same thing, okay? And so definitely unfold, one of those words that you want to keep in your dictionary and just to use in your personal day-to-day life because it has a lot of purposes. Then we have the word indignity, which is a noun and an act that offends against a person's dignity or self-respect. Here, you don't really have to focus too much on the word dignity. If you don't know what that means, just focus on the word self-respect. Synonyms would be offense, affront, outrage, epithet, gird, insult, slap, or slight. Antonyms here would be honor or glory. And the sentence reads as follows. He remembers all the indignities he had to suffer in the early years of his career as a low-ranking office worker. So indignity, of course, here meaning lack of self-respect or lack of respect for other people as well. He had to suffer indignities, meaning that there were other people who did not respect his singular identity as this lower working office worker. And so when you have a little bit of indignity, it tends to be very negative. Oftentimes this word is used in a negative light. And so please make sure you guys are doing that correctly. And some of these words are a bit more crass than others, like the word slap or slight. These ones, maybe we wouldn't really use in academic languages, but rather, affront, epithet, offense, or slight, or not slight, but insult. Those ones we would definitely use in more formal practices, okay? That's a good way, I guess, to maybe think of this. But definitely the word slap is not something you should be using in your more advanced vocabulary. So maybe just keep that one to just talking between your friends or during conversation. Then we have the word hysteria, which is a noun, behavior exhibiting overwhelming or unimaginable fear or emotional excess. Now, I'm going to pause right here because I'm pretty sure you guys noticed that there's something else written on the wall. And it reads as hysterikos or hystera. And I think that it's important that we talk about this word real quick in the Greek meaning because this word has a really interesting etymology to it, etymology being like its backstory as to how this word came into the English language. And I think I want to just maybe clarify this for you guys because this word isn't really used anymore in, just regular day-to-day writing. Hysterikos and hystera, like we don't really use these because of the fact that it is now very crass and very critical. Synonyms meaning agitation, delirium, fever, frenzy, insanity, uproar. Antonyms being calmness or self-possession. Pretty much it means to act insane or to be a little bit crazy. And the reason for that is because this word is actually related to the female anatomy and that the specific part of the body, this organ, because of its existence, women at the time. So, moving on to our plot summary, let's talk about The Great Expectations by Charles Dickens. Now, just as a little bit of an overview, of course, follows the life and experiences of Philip Pirrip, better known as Pip, as he comes into a large inheritance from a mysterious benefactor one day. And so, because his name is a little bit confusing, I'm just going to call him Pip, and the book itself also refers to this young gentleman as Pip. And so Pip is the main character, he's our protagonist, and it really centers around him growing into a man after one day he receives a large sum of money and an inheritance from somebody who he has met before, but he just doesn't quite know who, and now suddenly he has the opportunity to become somebody in the upper class. So an orphan named Pip lives with his sister and her husband in Kent. He goes to visit his family's graves on Christmas Eve when he realizes that he is not alone in the graveyard. An escaped convict threatens Pip to bring food and tools so he can release his chains. So this is how we really start off. Pip at this point is a very young boy, and one day on Christmas Eve, he decides he's going to go visit his family. Currently, he's living with his sister along with his sister's husband. And his name is Joe Gargery. So Joe and Mrs. Joe is how we refer to them. And Mrs. Joe is quite mean to Pip, and she's pretty strict, but Joe is incredibly kind to Pip, and he really does take care of him like he's his own family, and so Pip really enjoys hanging out with Joe. So one day when he goes to the graveyard, he decides he's going to go there by himself and just give his respects to his family. But then he sees somebody in the mists. He sees somebody in the shadows. And it turns out it's an escaped convict because in Kent, in the location where he was at, it wasn't uncommon for him to see like people from the nearby prison escaping in that general direction. And this convict kind of holds him together and grabs him by the collar and says, "Bring me food, bring me tools, get these chains off of me or else I'm going to kill you. And Pip, of course, this young boy who's absolutely mortified by what's going on, says, okay, I'll go get you something. And so he runs back home. Doing as the convict asks, Pip brings everything and goes back home when soldiers ask Joe Gargery to fix shackles, which ultimately are used to recapture the convict Pip aided, but the man clears Pip of any trouble by saying that he stole the food that's missing from the Gargery home. And so Pip goes back home, and again, it's Christmas Eve. Everybody knows during holidays, lots of food is being made. Of course, Pip, he is no exception. The family is making a lot of food, and there is this pie. And Pip decides, okay, I'm going to take this pie, and I'm going to take my brother-in-law, Joe's, tools, because Joe is a blacksmith. And so he grabs all these things, he goes to the convict eats, convict pulls his chains off, and then Pip kind of leaves him be. He gets to survive. And then a bit later on, a bunch of soldiers show up to the door and say, you're the blacksmith, right? I need you to fix these shackles. We're going to go catch a prisoner. And he goes, okay. And so Joe fixes these shackles. Pip follows the soldiers along with Joe. And then he sees that there are two men fighting in the marshes. And one of them is the man that Pip had helped out earlier. And so he puts these shackles back on this man, this convict, and instead of saying, no, he's the kid, he's the one who set me free, he doesn't actually say anything about Pip. Instead, he says, I stole the pie. I went into their house, I stole their pie, also I used their tools earlier, that's why they're not there, I'm the one who did all of it. So he takes full responsibility for what Pip has done at the time when he was trying to save him. A few years later, we skip ahead. Pip is called upon by Miss Havisham, an older woman known for being a recluse and refusing to get over her having been left at the altar on the day of her wedding decades ago. When Pip goes to visit, he meets Estella, Miss Havisham's adopted daughter, and falls in love. So she is a very rich woman who doesn't have a family per se, and she wants to be entertained. She wants to have liveliness around the house in a certain sense. And so she calls upon Pip to come over and hang out and just pretty much stay there and just hang out and just be another presence on the property so she doesn't feel too alone. And so, with this in mind, Pip goes and he's getting a little bit something out of it, and he talks to Miss Havisham and he notices that it's a very grand house, but very much in a state of decay, and she's very well known as well for constantly wearing her wedding dress because she was wearing it the day that her wedding was supposed to happen, but unfortunately the groom, the male, ended up leaving her at the altar and she never got over that. And it also has been several decades since, and so you can kind of imagine what kind of a dusty and dilapidated house this might be. At that same time, Pip meets Estella, who is Miss Havisham's adopted daughter. She doesn't really have too much of a background up until this point, but Estella's about the same age as Pip. And Pip starts to really like her and thinks that she's really pretty, and so he tries to hang out with her, tries to talk to her, and Miss Havisham just kind of washes on and says, go ahead, hang out, go play. I just want, some kind of entertainment around the house. Pip continues to visit Miss Havisham and Estella as he grows older and decides to learn a trade. He signs on to work as Joe's apprentice and becomes a blacksmith, but after 4 years of working under Joe, a lawyer named Mr. Jaggers tells Pip that he has been provided a considerable sum of money by a patron who remains nameless, in hopes that he will become a gentleman. Pip leaves for London and visits Miss Havisham, assuming once more that she is the anonymous patron who was giving him this money. And so Pip, as he's growing up, he keeps going to Miss Havisham's house, keeps hanging out with Estella, even meets this other kid, and they're kind of getting into fights every now and then, this other boy, but he doesn't really see him too much after that. However, Pip decides, okay, because of my status, because I'm a working class, I'm low class, I'm going to go into a trade, and I'm going to start making money for myself. The best thing I can do here in this instance is to work with Joe, and Joe is going to teach me to become a blacksmith. And so for 4 years, Pip works as a blacksmith, starting to become an apprentice. He knows the trade a little bit, he's starting to get a good hang of things, and then one day, a very famous criminal lawyer shows up at the door. And this lawyer, his name is Mr. Jaggers, and he says, are you Pip? Because I need to talk to you. There is an anonymous patron, or somebody who refuses to say their name out loud, who wants to give you a sum of money every month and hopes that this money will help you become a gentleman. And so hearing this, Pip thinks, oh my goodness, that's amazing. Yes, of course. Thank you so much. And Mr. Jagger says, you have to follow me to London. Pip says, okay, I'll go to London with you. And on the way to London, he decides he's going to stop by at Miss Havisham's house one last time and say thank you for the fact that she is the anonymous donor. One night, a malicious laborer named Orlick is involved in a dispute with Pip, and when he comes home, he sees that his sister, Mrs. Joe, is no longer able to speak due to the severe assault that he assumes was at the hands of Orlick. She passes away several years later and leaves as Joe and Philip. Joe is Pip's only familiar relation anymore. And I am squeezing this in here because it does come back later on, so just keep this in mind. Pip begins to live in an inn in the middle of London with Matthew Pocket, a cousin of Miss Havisham. He realizes then, as they begin to live together, that they were the same boy that would torment him and Estella when they were younger, but they remain cordial to one another afterwards. And so they're kind of boarded up together because of connections, and so they're being roommates. And as they're talking, saying hello, introducing each other, they realize, wait a second, you're that kid from Miss Havisham's house, the Satis house. You're that kid who I got into fights with. And instead of rehashing that fight, instead of getting into another altercation, they become the best of friends. And they continue to have a really good relationship for the rest of their lives. And they really rely on one another, Matthew Pocket and Pip. Joe Gargery comes to London to tell Pip that Estella is coming back to stay with Miss Havisham, and Pip, now living as a gentleman, or what he assumes is a gentleman, is embarrassed to be seen with Joe. Pip, still infatuated by Estella, is consumed by his complex affections for her and warns Estella to stay away from Drummle, an uncouth upper-class chap who seems to be vying for her attention. Once his 23rd birthday passes, Pip is told the identity of his benefactor, who is none other than Abel Magwitch, the escaped convict that he had helped years ago. And so I'm going to take a little bit of time to explain what's going on here. So, as Pip is living in London, he is trying to make a name for himself. He's using that income that comes in and trying to really establish himself as a gentleman. And also is still kind of in love with Estella. And so one day, Joe, as the consistent blacksmith he is, working class that he is, comes to visit, and they're eating dinner together, they're eating a meal together, and at one point, Pip feels that he is incredibly embarrassed to even be seen with Joe. And Joe, kind of understanding that, goes, all right, no worries, I just came here to tell you a message, and I get what you're trying to say. And so Pip learns that Estella is coming back to Miss Havisham's manor because she had been quite a while away in order to learn her manners and also go to a little bit of a boarding school in a sense and become a lady. And so while Estella was gone, Pip didn't really think too much about her, but Estella's back now, and so Pip feels that emotion towards her once more. However, there's a little bit of a meeting, or like I would say a dance, a ball that happens, and so Estella's there and there is a man named Drummle. And Pip already knows kind of who this guy is because he's becoming a gentleman.